Hi friends, it's Pleating Glue here, and today we are going to do our next installment of our Sew With Me project, which is putting together this cutie little romper here. And we cut everything in the last installment, and I wanted to show you just a couple things that I did since last time. The first of which is I fused my interfacing onto my waistband with the iron, and my marks disappeared, so I transferred my marks from my pattern back onto the back of that interfacing. And then the other thing I did was I went through and I serged all of the edges that are going to be exposed in my romper. So for the shorts pieces, that's going to be your short little inseam here, your crotch seam on all four pieces, so that's this curved piece, and then the out seam, which is this long edge here. And that's the same for all four pieces. And then I also serged the edges of all of my pocket pieces, so that's another four pieces like that. And then I think that was it, because our bodice piece, the edges of those will all be finished. And since we're lining our bodice piece, our side seams won't be exposed either. If you don't line your bodice piece, then you would want to serge those short side seams so that that's not just a raw edge. Okay, so we are ready to get started. Some of this we already did when we put our mock-up together, but we did skip a couple steps when we did that, so I'm going to go back over it. So our first step is we are going to be dealing with our bodice pieces first. So we can go ahead and put all the rest of this stuff aside for now. And we are going to gather the side edge of our upper front between the small circles. So that is going to be this long piece. I can take out all of my pins. And also, because I am lining this, I'm going to need to do all of these steps to both the linings and the fronts. So that's going to take a little extra time. To do all of that. Also, because my fabric does not have a right or left side, I need to be really careful not to make two left or two right sides. Which happens to the best of us. Just check it before you stitch it. Okay, those are my back pieces. These are my front pieces. So I'm going to ease stitch, which means base stitch. Going to lengthen my stitch length a little bit. And then go ahead and do ease stitches down all the side seams. Okay, so you've got your side seam ease in there. Now you need to put a small ease stitch also in the bottom of that. So that's going to be your other, it's not really straight, there's a little bit of a curve, but you're going to put another ease stitch in along this edge, and that is to go into the waistband later. Okay, so now we can attach our side seams. So we need to ease in the front piece so that it meets the back piece. Actually, I'm going to do one more row of gathering stitches on the side seams, just because it's not pulling in quite as nicely as I want it to. So the more rows of gathering stitches you do, the more evenly and attractively the fabric will pull in on itself. So that's something to keep in mind. And remember, I added some ease to this because I took that funny dart and transferred that fullness from the bust into the side seam. So now my side seam is going to be have much more fullness than it used to when I did my mock-up. So that's partly why I want this to be a little nicer looking, just because I'm dealing with a little bit more fullness there. So now I'm going to remind myself which piece, I cut this a while ago. How did I want this to work? Okay, I think this is my lining, so I'm not as concerned with this matching perfectly. Just want to make sure that I'm evenly distributing all of this fullness down the side seam, so I don't have any areas where there's a big, as we call it, a pookie. Nobody wants a pookie, which is where you get sort of a big fold of fabric on a seam that's otherwise fairly flat. Okay, so I've got that pinned together, and now I want to make sure that everything else ends up the same. So I need to remind myself which ones of these are my linings and which ones are the fashion fabric, and then make sure I'm doing a left and a right. Okay, so these are my two linings. Because those match. So now this will end up here. Okay, so those are my lining pieces. And now these should be my fashion pieces. I'm gonna throw in my second ease stitch. Okay, so there's our first seam. We can see that our gathers are spread somewhat evenly across that seam. I'm going to do that to all 4 of my seams, and then I'm going to go ahead and to the iron, and I'm going to press all of these seams open so that they lay nice and flat. the next part of our instructions tells us that we should roll hem all the way around this front bodice piece. I'm not doing that because I'm lining mine. So if that's what you're doing, then go ahead and follow the instructions. But if you are me and are lining it, this is a good example of when I sort of change a pattern a little bit. So we're going to be doing right sides together, and we're going to be attaching the lining to the front piece. So you want to make sure that you are putting the correct pieces together. So those are the two lining pieces, and these are, so this is one front piece and one lining piece. So I'm going to line these up right sides together, and I'm going to go ahead and stitch all the way around what will be the free edges of the bodice. So I'm not going to stitch together this piece because this is going to go into the waistband. I'm going to stitch from here all the way around and back to the waist piece here, making sure that my seams match and stitching right on that 5/8 seam line. Also going to be careful as I'm stitching here not to pull too much on these lines here that are on the bias, because if you pull that, it's going to pull the fabric off grain, and that is going to make your piece of clothing not lay flat against your body. So now we need to get this ready to turn right side out, which means we need to do a couple things. First of all, we need to clip this curve so that it will lay flat. Otherwise, it's going to be too tight. Basically, we need to open this up like this. So that when all of this seam allowance flips to the inside, it's going to look like that, and that's going to spread open inside that seam. The other thing I want to do, I don't really think that I need to trim down any of these seams. This fabric is very lightweight. I don't think it's going to make a difference. If anything, it's going to help me a little bit. I am going to understitch a little bit though. So figure out what is my lining and what is my right side. Understitching is when you're going to stitch the seam allowance to the lining or facing fabric, and that's going to help keep that seam allowance and lining from rolling out over that seam. It helps give you a nice crisp line when you turn that right side out. So I won't be able to go all the way in because these two pieces are get kind of narrow where the the ties start to narrow out, but that will not be a problem at that point. It's really just across the back and up that front that I'm worried about. Okay, so that's about as far as I can understitch. Now I will do the other side of the bodice. Okay, so now we're ready to turn these right side out. Now when you do this, you may not need to clip this corner. I like to try to not clip away seam allowance if I can avoid it. Like I said, this fabric is so thin that if you just fold that side and then fold that side and then kind of pinch that seam allowance as you turn, that corner should come out looking pretty sharp. And I like to avoid clipping seam allowance if I can avoid it, just because it gives the fabric a little bit more breathing room to kind of fray out a little bit. Because if you've clipped away all that seam allowance on the inside and then wash it and then it frays, there's not a lot keeping that fabric from fraying out of your corner and then making a hole in your piece of clothing. So if I can avoid it, I will do that. I say as I pull a thread by accident. But that corner is pretty sharp now. And then you can see down where I was able to understitch to, this seam is now, this edge is much easier to fold and turn than it is up here where I wasn't able to understitch. So I'm gonna go to the iron, flip these out inside out, or right side out, I guess, and press those edges nice and flat. Okay, so I've got my two bodice pieces are all bagged out now and ready to go. You can tell which side is your front now by the side that's not understitched. So it's hard to tell here, but I've got my understitching line here. And now we can join back up with our instructions here. So now the next part says to attach the waistband. So we're going to go ahead and attach this as matching up all of our lines and our notches. Okay, so the way that they're asking us to do this is kind of confusing, but basically we're going to bag out our waistband lining, bag out the lining with the waistband lining, and at the same time we're going to finish off the edges of our waistband. So it asked us to press up one edge of our waistband, so I did that 5/8 up, and then the other side we're going to stitch to our waistband along the seam line that we just stitched. So I'm actually going to stitch it from this side so I can see where I am. Okay, so we're stitching this at 5/8. We're stitching through that fold in the lining of the waistband. And then when we get to our old seam line, we're turning that corner and stitching straight across, right along our other stitch line. Okay, so then you can see how when we turn that, that's going to finish off the back of the waistband, and we're going to end up putting some hooks and eyes there. But I'm going to go ahead and grade out or trim out some of this seam allowance. Since we added this lining, it's gotten a little bit bulky. Got a lot of different layers in here. So I'm just going to take out some of this so that it's not quite so bulky against my waist. And then we're going to understitch that waistband lining down to the rest of our seam allowances. And grading is where you remove some of the seam allowance. You cut the seam allowances down at different heights so that they're not all the same length in your seam, making a big bulgy bump in your seam. Okay, so now we can turn our little waistband here. Again, fold into a right corner. Actually, I do want to trim a little bit of this. And now we can press our waistband down on both sides of that waistband and waistband facing, and then we are ready for the shorts. So for shorts pieces, we have all of our little pleat notches here that we can hopefully still see. It's very hard on striped fabric. So I'm going to match all of my notches, and then I can go ahead and top stitch those. Make sure they're opening the right way. Okay, so now we're going to stitch the inseams together. So we need to find a front and a back. And we're just stitching these really short inseams together right now. Alright, so now we've got our pocket stitched onto our side seams. So now we can close up that side seam. And the way that we do that is we're going to stitch this side seam from the top of the waist here to this mark here. And then we're going to stitch from here to here. And then we're going to stitch all the way around the pocket here. When you turn this right side out, you have a pocket. Okay, so now we're going to turn our pocket top towards our front edge. And we can press our pocket seam edge so that that lays flat, and we can press open our side seam. And then you do need to clip, into your back side seam allowance right underneath the pocket here so that you can open up your side seam and press that flat. Okay, so now I can attach these together. We're doing right sides together. Drop one leg into the other leg. Matching the inseam. And we're going to end where this notch shows us that our zipper starts. Okay, so we have our tops and we have our bottoms pretty much together. And next time we will put them together and then we'll put the zipper in and do all of our finishing. We're so close to being done. See you next time.